Maybe don't know.
This time, this time, this time, this time, this time to build, this time to build, this time to build, this time, this time to build, this time to build, this time to build, this time power, this time to build power, this time to build power, this time to build power.
What's up, everybody? I am your host, Chris Hampton. Welcome to episode 14 of the Power Company podcast, brought to you by PowerCompanyClimbing.com. I'm sitting here in Land of the Arches campground in lovely Red River Gorge, where temps have just recently dropped below the 80s, which thank goodness for that. We can actually get some real rock climbing in. First of all, before I go anywhere else, I just want to say shout out to all of our patrons. Some of you guys have really stepped up and come through for us. And what that means is that these guys are just basically, donating a monthly sum to the podcast. And, they just are helping us keep this thing commercial and sponsor free, which is how we want it to be, except for our own commercials. And you can do that at patreon.com/powercompanypodcast if you're interested. And if you're not, there's some other ways that you can help as well. We don't expect everybody to shell out money. So I did make a plea on our Facebook page, and a lot of you shared that, and a lot of you rated and reviewed us on iTunes, which I'm super stoked about. And I'd love for you guys who don't follow us on the social medias, because that's not for everybody, I'd love for you guys to go check out iTunes as well and rate us and review us. Apparently, it really helps. I don't know how it really helps, but the podcast powers that be tell us that it does. So if you could go on there, rate us and review us, that would be helpful. And if you do in return, because, if you guys do something for me, I want to do something in return for you, I will put out 4 extra episodes over the next 2 months. Because I've got like 24 or 26 episodes recorded and ready to go. And at this current pace, that could take us a year to get them all out, 2 years. So, I'd like to get these things out there into the world. They're great conversations, and you guys need to hear it. So go rate us, review us, and I will put out some extra episodes for you in the very near future. So today's guest, Charlie Manganiello. We talked with Charlie on episode 8, the deadlifting episode. Charlie works with Steve Bechtel over at ClimbStrong, and he also coaches at Elemental Performance and Fitness in Lander, Wyoming. And I really, a lot like Steve, I appreciate Charlie's sort of no-nonsense, very common sense approach to strength training and training for sports. And Charlie is also a very humble multi-sport athlete. He goes pretty hard at some other sports, and that's what I wanted to sit down and talk to Charlie about, is how you can climb well, train for climbing, and also perform well in these other sports. So let's get on with it.
Maybe don't know.
Your first step off a peak is down. It's never up. And you can either choose to fall and tumble off that peak by beating your head against the wall and trying to climb harder, or you can intentionally walk off the top of that peak, give yourself a little pat on the back, and then put your head down, and it's into the next cycle.
Okay. Why don't we just start with you telling me, you're going to have to toot your own horn a little bit here. You don't seem like the guy who does that a lot, but
I don't like to.
I'm going to force you here. Talk to me about the sports you're involved in and kind of what level you're at with them. Because I know you do some other things than climbing, and you do them well. So toot your own horn a little bit here.
Oh, man.
Oh man, everyone's gonna make fun of me. All right, here we go. My name's Charlie.
Only in Wyoming are they going to make fun of
Okay,
you.
That's true.
And they're not going to listen to that here. So
My name's Charlie Manganiello. The sports I'm primarily involved with, say in the last 5 years, would be climbing, mixed between trad, alpine climbing, and sport climbing, and bouldering, I guess. Skiing, lots of backcountry skiing, and kind of mountain running, or I guess they call it ultra marathoning now. No races with that.
I think
just
there's a difference between mountain running and ultra marathoning. I'm just going to go ahead and say that.
my friend always teases me. He says anything over whatever the 26.1 for marathons is, he considers an ultra.
Anything
I don't
over
agree with
about
that.
45 feet, I consider too far. So
That's true. The levels, trad climbing scares the crap out of me. But I do like it, and I like to do the 5.8, 5.9 fun stuff, primarily in the Wind River Range, Red Rocks, stuff like that. The climbing, the bouldering is something that I started off doing and took pretty seriously. And I've gotten up into the V9 range. I've been super close on some 10s. I'm not quite there. It's definitely a goal that's in my mind, and hope to get there soon. And then the sport climbing in this past year is something I've really focused on with ClimbStrong and Steve at the gym at Elemental Performance and Fitness here in Lander. And it's been super humbling. People are like, man, you're such a strong boulderer. You're going to crush 13s. And I think it's a little bit of a mental thing for me, just getting past the I can do this, not like the fear of falling or anything, but it is crazy how you can really just tell yourself that you're not able to climb a certain grade.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to defeat yourself before you even leave the ground.
Yeah, and just shut down. But yeah, I've been psyched. It's been really fun. I really almost kind of felt like I've learned how to climb again.
Cool.
By doing more sport climbing, and wow, it really makes a difference if your foot stays on or not. And bouldering, you can kind of expend that energy, and it doesn't really always matter because it's only 8 moves anyways. And you can be cool and powerful and get the photo for the big leg swing. But yeah, so 12C is my hardest red point to date, which is really cool. I'd like to get to 13A. 13B, I've got some projects that I think will go, but will take more time. And then the skiing, I grew up alpine racing, New England pack powder, so I learned how to ski and really only ski on ice. A couple powder days here and there.
Absolutely horrifying.
Yeah, I mean, I like to think it built some character for me when I was young. I mean, I just remember being at Wildcat or Attitash up there in the Mount Washington Valley, 20, 30 below, and skimpy ass GS suit. And I was also super small. I technically was a pretty good skier, but I was racing against kids that were 160, 180. And I'm your typical climber build. I was super small and skinny, and so I was just a fart in the wind, really, on the hill compared to those dudes. But it has been fun to come out here to Wyoming. I guess I've been here since 2011, and get trained up on my level 1 and level 2 avalanche certifications, and get into backcountry skiing. And it's actually been super fun. It's been a way to kind of mix the climbing and the skiing, where there's some systems involved with ropes and rappels to get into some gnarly couloirs up in the Tetons or Togety Passes, where Lander folks usually ski. And it's been fun, actually. BJ's a really good skier, BJ Tilden.
Yeah.
And
I see the photos, and I just choose to ignore them because it makes no sense to me.
It's a whole other ballpark back there. But yeah, I'd love to ski the Grand one of these days. But yeah, I've put myself in some no-fall zones on skis, and it's been super fun.
Now, Steve mentioned something to me about records on these things that you're looking toward, on either skiing or running in the mountains or something to that effect. He didn't give up many details, so that's why I'm making you give them up.
Oh man, you could have just pry them out of me. There's a ton of really good runners here in Lander, and runners in the Tetons. I kind of have my own personal best, and I guess if you're really asking me to toot my own horn, I would say I'm above average. I've kind of set my own personal goals with running. I was injured last season, so I wasn't climbing much, but Running Wind River Peak. It's the highest peak in the southern winds. It's up around just low 13,000 feet. It's like a 26-ish mile run, and I've done that in 8.5 hours. And I think the fastest known time is like 7.5.
Wow.
An hour is quite a long time, but it was cool to kind of train for that and do it. And then another goal of mine last season was to do Gannett Peak in a day, and that's Wyoming's highest point, and that's also in the northern Wind River Range. And I was able to do that in just over 16 hours.
That's
37 miles. But it's super humbling because the record on that is like just over 8 hours.
Wow.
I just wanted to finish it in 24.
Yeah.
But I think I could go faster on that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the reasons I want to talk about this stuff is not because I'm a runner, because I ran cross country around my high school ages, but those days are long gone.
Sure.
I don't even like to drive cross country now, but a lot of my clients do. They love to run, and a lot of climbers do. It's a good activity if you're up in the mountains, and it seems like a good rest day thing, but it's really hard to keep it a rest day thing. It's really easy to go hard.
It's damn near impossible.
Yeah, and I want to know what to talk to people about as far as how do you switch up from sport to sport, or can you switch up from sport to sport effectively? Do you have to just accept mediocrity in some of them or all of them?
Oh man, that is a loaded question, and that I'm sure it will take up most of our time. It's one that we get asked a lot at the gym. It's one that I struggle myself with, and I see it all the time at the crag or folks talking about wanting to combine the running and the climbing, and it's really hard for people to understand or grasp the two different concepts. Steve said in that one podcast, runners should climb as much as runners should climb as much as climbers run, and vice versa. And there's nothing wrong with running. Like, it's totally cool.
Yep.
And a lot of people like it. But if we're talking purely about being a better climber and using all your focus and your energy and your adaptation potential, like, running is taking something away. Not that you can't do it on a rest day or kind of have these seasons where maybe you run a little bit more because it's super hot in Lander in July, like it is right now, and you can kind of focus a little bit more on running. But you really have to own the decision and not justify like, oh, I'm just gonna run a little bit, and it's just gonna blow up eventually in your face.
Yeah, and I think that's the important thing, is own the decision. Like, make your decision. And sometimes that decision is gonna be, I want to be a good climber, I want to be a good runner, and I'm willing to sacrifice a little bit on either end to be good at both of them. So, and I think that's something that you're not necessarily struggling with, but that you're trying to balance. And so I'm just interested in digging into, how do you balance that? Like, how do you balance it? Like, do you run while you're climbing training, or while you're climbing performing, or do you quit entirely the running while you're training for climbing? How does it work for you?
Yeah, I guess I've tried two ways, and it would kind of, I guess, be examples from the last 2 summers. I tried the, like, oh, I'm just going to try to be good at everything, or, try to
be
PR and everything. Yeah. At once. And it was funny. I was working, I wasn't at the gym full time, and I could tell Bechtel was like, yeah, we'll see how that goes for you. And it was not me trying to be like, oh, I'll show him. I was just like, I really thought I could do it.
Yeah.
And it didn't happen. I mean, I just was okay at both things. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. Like, I hope folks, like understand that you can like be a runner and a climber.
Yeah. Whatever you enjoy, that's what you should be doing.
And there are some serious athletes out there. I don't know this gentleman in particular, but I know Steve knows someone who lives over in the Teton Valley, and he's like top level runner. He's pretty high up there, and he also climbs, 13 plus, or I think even 14 minus. And what Steve has said in other podcasts, or what I've seen in my own kind of training and training other folks, is he's making, or maybe he isn't making a decision, but he is literally taking away from one
Right.
of those
That's what I was
sports.
going to say.
Yeah,
Just because he's climbing harder than we are
Yeah.
doesn't mean he's climbing his best
Yeah,
or
exactly.
running his best.
Yeah, and that's the thing. People confuse their best with other people's best.
Yeah.
Like, people are like, I know people that do half marathons and climb for 514. Like, that's not you. I mean,
Right.
they're just a completely different
Totally
animal,
different person.
mutant athlete.
Yep.
But they are taking away from their own red points because of that.
Sure.
And a hybrid of, kind of to your question, is you can pick seasons, and you can choose to kind of have a red point season, maybe have a strength season, and maybe you have like, I want to get out in the mountains and the alpine, that small window, whether it be in the western kind of United States or wherever you live, where it's like the summer hot kind of non-red point season.
Yep.
And then kind of pick and choose, or cycle through those maybe in 4-month cycles. So it'd be 4 months, 4 months, 4 months, 4 months, 4 months, 4 months.
Right.
And that's
or whatever your
yeah.
local area dictates.
Mhm.
I guess in that sense, when you're planning those seasons out, you kind of have to think about the weather in your area and plan your red point season for when the weather's good.
Absolutely.
If you're a Red River climber and you're planning to red point in July and August, you've fucked up.
Yeah,
so.
exactly. Exactly. And that's what needs to happen when you're planning any sort of training. It's the 5 years out or the 3 years out even. You can't think about the strength training or the climbing training that you want to do like 2 months out. You've already missed the boat. Like, you're too late. And so you have to look at a calendar. And if you're really serious about getting better at whatever sport, it doesn't have to be running. I know running is definitely the thing that seems to always come up in the climbing world. But you have to be like, okay, I want a red point during the fall. I mean, that's like where most people want a red point. In the spring here, it's nice and cool, or say the desert in the summer. But you have to be able to pick that calendar apart and tell yourself like when you're going to shut the climbing down, or when you're going to shut the running down, or when you're going to shut the strength climbing down, to then have a 3-4 month build into whatever season you're going into. And I've seen it with some pretty top level climbers, and BJ's another example of it. I mean, this guy is one of the best sport climbers around, right?
Absolutely.
And I saw 2 very distinct seasons from him. 2 years ago, he came off climbing super hard at Wolf Point, and then he just shut it down like sometime around December, and then just focused on skiing. He wasn't necessarily training for skiing, but he just told himself, or at least as far as I could tell, and he could tell me I'm full of shit, but he just really stopped climbing and wanted to ski a bunch. He had some trips planned with some friends. He ended up, I think, skiing the Grand for the second time, which is like totally no small feat. I mean, people dream of climbing or skiing the Grand. And I think also in that same trip, he skied off the skillet or glacier there, the handle off of Mount Moran. And then he had an awesome season. Like, he basically, if you put it into climbing terms, climbed a couple 514s, and then March hit and he was back to climbing again. And people think that if you take that time off, you're going to start from like complete ground zero. Yeah, you're going to start weaker, and the climbs are going to feel harder, but you get that strength back super easily, and then you can get right back into your groove, and then you can maybe climb the next winter or choose to go skiing.
Yep. And I think using that BJ metaphor, using him as the example, I'm talking with him later this week about what I'm just about to say now, and I think this is part of why there are BJs out there who can, and you who can switch from sport to sport and do fairly well, is because, BJ may not necessarily train, so to speak, for any of the sports he's good at. But what he does when he goes out there is he's very, very mindful of what he's doing, and he approaches it analytically and like he's practicing all the time. He notices small things that he can change to make himself better constantly. And I think that's really important when you're not just training for one sport or trying to excel in one sport, but especially when you're trying to excel in multiple sports at once, is you can really cut down on the physical toll that it's taking on you by being mentally aware and being mindful of what you're doing. So I think that's a super important thing that I'm sure that you do, because you're a kettlebell guy and a coach who's constantly noticing those things with other people. So I'm sure that you do it with yourself.
Yep.
And I know that BJ does it because I've been watching it day in and day out while we're up at the rodeo wave climbing, and I'm impressed by it every day. So I think that's super important.
Yeah, and another example of this is Steve and I both had to do a pretty rigorous strength training program for one of our Strong First certifications. It's a level 2. It's the next one up from that level 1, if folks are familiar. But one of the strength tests is having to press half your body weight. And as
I remember Steve practicing for this last year.
Yeah, and as a climber and also a little guy, I mean, I'm like 155 pounds, and putting, it was like weight classes, so I had to put 80 or 79 pounds over my head. It was like seemingly impossible. We both didn't even press the weight until we got to the certification. I went into it like, well, I hope it goes.
Yeah.
I hope the group psych kind of gets me to put this thing up overhead. But I focused on it. I was committed.
And you went in with something of an injury,
yeah,
kind of leading up to it, right?
Shoulder, yep.
Yeah.
And so I kept doing the workouts. I kept making that the focus. I was still climbing. I was bouldering a bunch. I was doing these press workouts. But my climbing suffered, but it wasn't a bad thing, because when you focus on something, say it's not climbing, if that's what we're talking about, if you're listening to this and you're scared of letting go of the climbing training cycle, focus on something, do it for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, or mine was like, 4 or 5 months. I did it. I felt super good about it. It was, that feeling you feel after red pointing something that you've tried 50 times. And what's cool about that strength training is you're never far from it really ever again, unless you completely just let it go. But Steve and I were just talking about it the other day. I'm still pretty close to pressing the 79-pound kettlebell, the half pound or half body weight press, which was completely impossible in the beginning. But now I don't have to work as hard. I've already done all that hard work, and I can go into it, and maybe I'll do a couple press cycles and be able to get it for my recertification. And it's the same thing with climbing. You put the hard work in, you have a great red point season, or maybe not even a great, maybe a mediocre red point season, and you come off and you do some strength training, or maybe you're into running and you want to, train for a Tough Mudder or something. I don't know. But you're not going to lose what you think you're going to lose. It's just not going to happen. I mean, I see really good climbers. I mean, the average climber around Lander, climbs like 13 plus, but I've seen people come off injuries, or just their motivation wasn't very high, or been, out for a few months, and I still see them get on 12 pluses, and they might have to fight for it. And
it comes back fast.
Yeah, they might have that crazy forearm burn, but it comes back fast, and they do it.
Yeah, and I've just experienced that myself.
Yeah.
When I was here last year, I was, just able to start doing, inclined push-ups and, doing extremely inclined rows. And so it was scary, because I'd just come off my hardest red point, and then all of a sudden I'm having surgery, and they're telling me you're not going to be full strength again for 18 months, and I'm freaking out.
Yeah, you're like, I'm not going to be able to climb 5'9" again.
Right. But 6 months after surgery, I sent my hardest boulder problems.
Yeah.
And now I'm feeling stronger than I ever have on the rodeo wave, which is a pretty burly little wall.
Yeah.
So
it's bouldering, really.
So and I'm a little over a year out from surgery. So, and that's doing nothing for months, complete atrophy in my shoulder. If you're quitting climbing for a couple of months, but being physical in other ways, then you're not going to lose a ton, And if you're climbing a little, like you said, you were still going climbing, you were still bouldering, you were just focused on the overhead pressing. You're maintaining,
exactly,
at the very least.
Exactly.
So, and if you're taking that same practice approach that we just talked about, you're probably getting better. You may not be becoming a stronger climber necessarily. You're still going to have to transfer this new strength that you've got from overhead pressing into your climbing, but you're becoming better by taking a more practice-oriented approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And Bechtel talked about it a little bit in that last deadlift podcast we did. The strength training or the climbing training or the running training you do, it's the whole investment strategy or money analogy. That money that you put away from your 2-week paycheck when you're 26 years old is going to be what you use when you're 50 years old, 60 years old. It's the same thing with the training. You have to go into any of these cycles of this training thinking about the 5-year goal, the 5-year plan. That stuff is, I feel like the strength training that I did literally this day last year is now like coming into play.
For sure.
And the strength training I did yesterday is what I'm going to use a year from now. You have to think of it in that long-term investment. You're not going to make a quick buck on any of these workouts. It's all about stacking them in your favor throughout the season. And I get that question a lot. I see it in the gym. I see people get really strong, and I hear folks in my class or people in the gym like, wow, that person's really strong, or how did you get to be that strong? And they must just be a freak of nature.
Right.
And all those people do, I mean, I'm in the gym every single day. I know exactly what they do. They come in, they punch the clock, and not that they're like being lazy or not intentional with their workout, but they get in there for 50 minutes to an hour and a half, and they do it, and they are there 2-3 times a week, every single week. And that's why they're so strong. And it's the same thing with climbing.
Yeah, exactly. They're putting the work in.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you're in the middle of a red point season and you're climbing well.
Mm-hmm.
How do you know when to cut it off and start training for the next season or for the next sport? Maybe if the weather continues, do you just continue with climbing even though you've got goals in the other sports, or do you lay it out on the calendar and kind of let the calendar guide you?
I mean, the short answer is you don't know, but I think there are tricks or ways to hold yourself accountable, because that's really, really hard to do. And we see it in the gym all the time. People will PR on a lift, and they just immediately, they won't even take the gratification of like pulling their hardest weight off the ground. They'll just want to, okay, next week I'm going to try more. Next week I'm going to try more.
Right.
So I think that's why having a calendar and planning out what you want to do. I mean, be realistic, right? Like, if you're a 12 plus climber and you're like, my goal is to climb 12A, then you haven't done your job,
right?
To push yourself. But if
you're just looking for gratification,
you're like,
I
just want to feel that like nice warm hug. You say you're climbing 12B, 12C, and your goal should be, or that's your hardest red point to date. Maybe your goal is 12D, 13A. Once you get a couple of those, or maybe even just one, your first step off a peak is down. It's never up. And you can either choose to fall and tumble off that peak by keep beating your head against the wall and trying to climb harder, or you can intentionally walk off the top of that peak, give yourself a little pat on the back, and then put your head down, and it's into the next cycle. And you can extend it, I think, if you want to. I mean, it's I think it's up to the individual, and you have to kind of know how your body reacts to that stuff. But you can only do it so long, and then you have to come down.
Yep. And I think it takes season after season of doing this to know where the peak is.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you're just starting training and you're if you're a 5'10" climber and you just really started dedicating yourself to climbing and practicing, and your first season, you don't necessarily want to stop at 10B. You might be at the 11C level already. It's hard to know when to stop at first. But I think once you've invested, year after year into this thing, it gets easier to learn okay, I can feel like my body, I can feel that it's at its peak right now. It's about to start going downhill. And then you can make those kind of decisions.
Yep.
I think it's tough early on, just for the people out there listening
Absolutely.
who are just getting psyched on this stuff. It's tough to know, you know?
And we all have experienced it when you first start climbing. I mean, those numbers jump up so quickly.
Yeah.
And you don't really have a peak. You just keep getting better because you're like, oh,
Right.
now I know what a heel hook is, and
Yep.
now I know what an undercling is, and I can put my body in different positions to do different moves. But then once you start to get that plateau, maybe around, I feel like it's 11, I don't know, maybe 11 plus. You
Yeah,
start to kind of
I think there's a
plateau.
few of them right
Yeah.
around 12A, and then probably right around 12 plus 13 minus.
Yep.
You know, it depends on the person, but
Yep.
usually right around there.
And then that's when the more experienced climber, and whether it's 5 years or 20 years, you have to be psyched that you got your goal and then move on. But when you're just like climbing 510s, like just keep trying to push it and climb more. I don't think the super focused calendar of seasons or strength training for that kind of beginner climber
Yep.
isn't really necessary.
Yep,
You just got to keep climbing.
I agree. In fact, I even tell people to climb into and through the bad season. You know,
Yep.
I see a lot of people kind of watch the season that I'll stick to. You know, in the red for years, I stuck to this. You climb in the spring, you climb in the fall. I don't even go to the red in the summer, and maybe in the winter I'll go a day or two, just because it happens to be a nice day. But I don't go out there with intentions to perform, generally speaking. And I see new climbers latch onto that, who've climbed up to 5'11", maybe 5'12", and they're like, oh, I'm not climbing this summer, and I'm like, why? You need to be doing hundreds of 5'10s and 11s.
Yeah, and do it in
Go out there
crappy
and do it.
conditions.
Yeah, go out there and practice and just build this giant base underneath you. I think that's really important.
Well, yeah, and we all have home crags, right? And we climb in the bitter cold sometimes up at Sinks, and it sucks. But those are the days you maybe go down 4 grades and you just do volume. It's not a red pointing day. Even if it was like, at least with Sinks, sometimes you can have like some really awesome red pointing days in the winter. But maybe the weather turned on you and you just have to. And I guess that's what I was to finish the whole when to come off a peak. I guess this ties in. Is you can make a plan and you should follow your plan. Definitely follow your plan through. Like the worst thing we see in the gym is someone tries a strength training plan or a climbing plan for 2 days, 2 weeks, and like, it didn't work.
It's not gonna work.
This this plan's bullshit. And it's like, well, you didn't finish it, and and maybe it is a terrible plan, but the benefit of actually following through with a plan is super important as your training progresses, because there are going to be times where you don't want to finish it. But as soon as you create that default or that habit in your own workout patterns, it's going to creep into other parts of your workout, whether you like it or not. And people always say, no, not me. But the way you do one thing is the way you do everything. Yep. And I remember learning that the hard way when I was like early 20s. I remember my mentor, 10 years older than me, saying that to me. And I'm like, what do you mean? Like, I'm just making a little shortcut here. And he's like, man, if you start shortcutting one way, it's going to creep into your professional life, your workout life, your love life, whatever.
Yeah.
It was a valuable lesson. I think the same thing goes for working out.
And I think it's even harder to, like you were just saying with Sinks, here it's even tougher to know, because you can kind of climb all year round here, and the conditions are pretty good all year round. Even though it's 100 degrees in town right now, you go up to Wild Iris early in the morning and in the shade, and it's 65, 67 degrees. It Sinks, it could be, I don't know, 10 degrees in town, and it's, nice and sunny up at the wall. So
yeah, I mean, we're pretty spoiled here. I mean, everyone just has seasonal projects, and that's why you don't see any locals climbing up at Sinks in the summer, even though it's like totally fine when it's not in the sun.
Yeah.
People just know they have to climb there all winter.
Yeah.
And
so it's tough to know when to quit, So I like the idea of, hitting your peak, really paying attention to what your body's telling you, and then being okay with stepping off the peak instead of fighting it.
Yeah. And I guess the last thing I'll say on that is you don't have to be married to the plan. You have to have a plan first to even follow something or follow through. But yeah, I mean, maybe you're just feeling super strong and, maybe a 2-week extension on what you thought would be your peak. Go for it. Give it a whirl and write it down, like write how you felt, write the grades you climbed. People always forget it,
They forget so fast.
Yeah, I mean, between even 2 days of a class, people will forget like what weight they lifted. And like, Charlie, what weights lifted? I'm like, I don't remember. I can barely remember my weights. That's why I write them down.
Yeah.
But write that stuff down, and maybe you don't even look back at it. I mean, you should. But by writing it down, I think you almost even commit it to memory a little more.
For sure.
But it's also
It's
a great
like cheating on tests when you were in high
That's
school.
right. That's right.
If you write a cheat sheet, you don't need it.
That's right. And then it is really good to look back at that stuff, because then you can know what worked. You're like, what did I do for the last 2 months before this awesome peak, so I can try to recreate it.
Yep.
And you can't always recreate it. And then on the flip side of that is maybe your calendar's too aggressive and you can feel your body shutting down. There's no reason. It's no different than not going to the summit. Weather rolls in, someone's got high altitude sickness or whatever your analogy you want to use. There's really a ton of value in being just, I'm going to pull the plug. We want athletes to kind of push themselves through any discomfort or get them out of their comfort zone. But then there's just the obvious, like, if we go to the top of this summit, we're going to die.
Yeah, you want them to be able to push themselves next week too.
Exactly.
Not just today.
Yeah, exactly. And the worst thing an athlete can do is get injured, and that's what we're always trying to prevent, because then they're out and they can't train, they can't put any money in the bank. They're basically they're using money to go to PT and not use it on their gym membership.
Yeah.
And that could be, I mean, you know what that's like. It's awful.
For sure. So you've switched over to training for the next sport or training for your next round of Red Point season or whatever. It's really easy to just keep training. Training's fun. A lot of people love it. It's easier to quantify than performance is in any of these sports. You can time your skiing and you can time your running, and that's quantifiable, but when you're skiing well, and when you're making tons of mistakes, and the time may not necessarily reflect that. The same as with climbing. You may climb a harder number, but whether it was harder for you or not.
Yeah, it might be your style or whatever.
So how do you know when to stop training and actually start trying to perform in the next sport? Is that another, sort of pay attention to your calendar or listen to your body, or is it both of those things?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. We never want to stop training, but we certainly want to cut the volume down and whatever, weights we're using. We always want to maintain the strength that we have or the strength that we've built, but you don't have to do much. I mean, you certainly don't want to do it once a month. You're gonna have a terrible trajectory of strength if you do that. But sometimes you can do every 4 to 5, maybe 6 days, where maybe it's one strength session 1 week, and then it's 2 the next week, 1 the next week, 2, 1, 2, whatever. You'll find out what works best for you, and that's why it's really important to write down those numbers, because a good example for at least for climbing, and I'll give an example for weight training, is that we have a famous climb called Killer. It's a 12C. Everyone, that gets on it for the first time is like, holy cow, this thing is super hard.
Way harder than
And then you
12C.
see someone like, Steve Babbitt or Steve Bechtel get on it, and you're like, that looks like a 5'10". But Steve knows in his training or in his climbing world, if he gets on Killer and he falls on it or it feels really hard, he's lost something. Like, he needs to go back to the drawing board. He's like, well, maybe I haven't climbed as much as I wanted to or should have. And it's the same thing with the strength training. I mean, we all have numbers we should know, like our bench press, deadlift, maybe our front squat, to just kind of have a baseline. And so, like, if I go into the gym and I can't pull like 315 pounds for a deadlift, I know I have not deadlifted for a really long time, or I've got weak in my hamstrings or my posterior chain, and I need to get back into it, or I have not done the necessary maintenance to keep my strength to then build on another cycle. So I know that's super individualized, but that's kind of up to the athlete to make sure they know.
Yeah, and I think if you have those baselines and you know where you're at, especially with strength training, that's something that's going to apply to all of your sports, no matter what they are. That deadlift is going to help you in climbing, it's going to help you in skiing, it's going to help you in running, just having that general overall body strength. So if you have those numbers, that's a good way to be training for all of your sports
Absolutely.
at once. So
yeah, I mean, the stronger you are, and folks have probably heard this analogy. It's a Brett Jones quote where it's think of a big glass jar, like that's your strength, and then everything you put in the jar is the running, the climbing, the swimming. Maybe you're a triathlete, and the stronger that glass, the strength training, the more you can do, better.
Yeah,
if you have a really weak strength base, that glass is smaller. It's like a shot glass.
Yep.
And maybe you're only doing one thing. You can't, it's really cool when you get to this point of being like strong for you. And people always talk about different numbers. You need to know what's good for you. But you could just Google like what's a good deadlift for my body weight, bench press, and you can look that up. But if you keep maintaining the strength, it's really cool when you're never far from being strong, where you can get off the couch and go do a big hike up the Grand or something, or get off the couch and go, climb 12A, or get off the couch and, do a sprint triathlon in your hometown and do pretty well. And that's all we're trying to say when you're trying to maintain strength. You're never far from it. You never get to that point where you're starting from ground zero again.
Yeah. And would it be fair to say that, one of the important things for training for multiple sports, more so than just one single sport, would be to keep your athleticism up and and I think strength is a big part of that. For instance, when I was younger, I was definitely a better athlete than I am now. I've focused more on climbing than I have any other sport for a long time now. And I can tell when I go get on a skateboard that I'm a little clunkier than I used to be.
For sure.
Or when I try to run, I definitely can't run like I used to, or whatever it is. Gymnastics, I definitely don't have the mobility and flexibility I once did. So I can tell that my athleticism has dropped, and that's been something I've focused on more the last 3 or 4 years, is gaining some of that athleticism back.
Yep.
So, is that a fair statement to make?
Absolutely. And it's, I remember before I got into training and being a coach, I truly thought it was rocket science of how to train and be strong.
Yeah.
And yes, it totally can get super specific in whatever sport you choose. But there's only literally 4 major movement patterns that you really need to focus on. And it's a hip hinge, it's a squat, it's a push and a pull. And that should be your focus for strength training. And that's what makes an athlete, because they're strong in all those things and they're balanced. We see it with the climbers. You could strap a 100-pound kettlebell on most kettlebell on a climber, and they could pull 100 pounds plus their body weight. Right. And you put them under a barbell on a bench press, and they're like, can't even do their body weight.
Right.
And if someone can't do their body weight, it's an obvious sign that they're not as athletic as they should be. And it's the same thing. You see a lot of folks that are quadzillas that love squatting, and they have a really good squat, but if their squat isn't close or about the same as their bench press, there's an obvious imbalance, and they're not as athletic as they should be, and they're not an athlete really.
Sure.
And I was there a few years ago. We had a great trainer. He doesn't live in town anymore, but he got me super psyched on it, and God, he got me under the bench press, and I think I was like 155 at the time, or I guess what I am now. And I think I did like 135 once, and it was like the hardest thing I've ever done. He's like, "You are weak."
Yeah.
And I thought I was like a strong dude.
That's hard. That's hard to stomach.
Yeah, it's super hard. I mean, he couldn't. I thought being strong was like holding on the end of a door frame, which he couldn't do. But bench pressing is very humbling if you're not good at it.
For sure.
And my front squat was up, but yeah, my bench was way off. And you know, everyone knows the push, like the bench press will help with injury for climbers. And there's actual science behind it. Like your body has a governor. It's kind of the best way to describe it. Where if you get so strong at the pull and you don't get good at a push, your body will eventually shut your
It'll
pull
stop
strength
your
down.
pull, yep.
Yeah, and so it's literally like not being strong at a push, which we don't really do in climbing that much anyways, actually does hurt your climbing.
For sure. So since we're talking a ton about, you know, having a baseline, having these numbers that you can go back to, and test yourself, do you have some basic numbers that you think climbers should be looking for?
Yeah. Let's see. So the deadlift, I know we mentioned in the last podcast, males, and this is kind of high, but like if anyone can do double their body weight for a deadlift, that is strong enough.
And that's for men.
That's for men, and for women about 1.5 times. And again, we're talking about being strong enough. We're not talking about being the next power lifter,
right?
At the, you know, some CrossFit games or something.
Yep. And then once you get to that number, that's where you should aim to maintain.
Yep.
You should stop focusing all your energy on the deadlift at that point.
And even if you're a little below it, that's fine. But that's a good benchmark. Folks should be able to bench their body weight. And
you think that holds true for men and women?
Yep.
Okay.
And then, and maybe 0.75 for females, just because the muscle mass. I'd have to actually check on that. Maybe I'll get back to you on that. And then front squat should equal bench. So you shouldn't have like a 200-pound front squat and a 100-pound bench press.
Right.
And you know, body weight front squats. But you can certainly go up way more from that for sure. You know, 1.5, 1.25 for folks.
And then pulling, because climbers love to do pull-ups. And I generally try to keep them to a minimum, even though people are like, you know, I'll get these notes every day from people's training, and they're like, you know, did the workout, added 75 pull-ups. And I'm like, come on, you know.
Yep.
When you tell me 2 days later that you can't do your workout, I'm going to be like, why did you do 75 extra pull-ups?
Yep.
But do we have a rough pulling weight?
I don't have one.
Okay.
I would say 90% of climbers just don't even need to worry about it.
Yep.
I mean, they're so strong. And I know there's plenty of dudes and females that can't do 1 or 2, but they still have, like, if you got them on a bent over row or did a lat pull down like cable machine, they would hit the number.
Right.
They just don't need to. There's, you know, it's fun to, you know, if you're
sure.
at the Climbers Fest and you want to, you know, win the pull-up competition, there's plenty of awesome pull-up programs. And it'll probably even maybe not hurt your climbing, but even help your climbing. But yeah, I don't think anyone, and we've even wrote strength programs where, for climbers where we just don't even have a pull in there.
Yeah, I keep them out quite a bit.
Yep.
In fact, about the only time I put them in is when there's, you know, it seems there's some sort of stability issue going on, and then it's generally rows, some sort of inverted row. Or, you know, if the people are so adamant that they have to be doing pull-ups, then maybe we'll do some sort of, you know, heavy hard style pull-up where they're, you know, we're making sure they're keeping a hollow body and, you know, making sure they're doing it perfect.
And the one that we use, one we use is, you know, really specializing it. So we'll do like the one arm inverted row where they'll be down, you know, on their heels, and it's just mimicking climbing.
Yep.
I can't imagine a lot of people in the strength world would be wanting to do one arm inverted rows, but we do because it makes us stronger and it's lock off strength. Yeah,
and when you're climbing, you're doing hundreds and hundreds of rows every session. You know, so
it's no different than a skier wanting to do one leg squats because that's what you're doing every time you turn.
Right, and you know, I heard this was a good point that I heard a flexibility expert point out once. He said, if you go into a yoga class or, a dance class or whatever, everybody sitting down are stretching their hamstrings. They go in, they start stretching their hamstrings. This is what they do. They're all ridiculously flexible. Their belly buttons are on the floor when they're in a straddle. They're, that's what they're all doing. And that's the one thing none of them need to be doing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, and we all want to do what we're good at, especially when people are watching.
Oh, yeah, I love
it. And you go into a class and you just get smoked by a bunch of like 45-year-old women. And they're super strong.
That's why I don't go into those classes.
Yeah, that's right. But yeah, the thing that you're not doing is what you need to do.
Yeah,
I mean, bottom line, and people know that. If you're honest with yourself, you know what you need to do.
Yeah, and that like we're talking about here in general, I think that helps out your athleticism, that helps out your strength, that helps out you being better at other sports and being able to transfer what you're learning, in the weight room over to those sports.
Mm-hmm.
The more athletic you are, the easier you're going to have it when you try to pick up the next sport for the next season or whatever.
Yeah, and one of the things that people need to also do is like own what you're doing. And what I mean by that, I guess a couple different things, is when you're like, take it seriously. I think some people think that it's lame or you get made fun of if you're like, oh, I'm not going to go out tonight because I'm trying to climb hard tomorrow. Those are usually the people that are climbing hard or climbing better than their peers.
Yep.
And again, there's nothing wrong with drinking a bunch of beers at the crag. We've all been there.
Mm-hmm.
But I've saw it a lot this summer actually, where people would come off their project and like, oh man, I almost had it, and then they slug a beer, and then they go try it again, and they got like super close. And I'm like, I just look at them like, imagine like what you would have done if you didn't just slug a beer.
Right.
And so again, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not trying to rain on anyone's parade, and I've certainly been there. But you have to be like, I'm going to have this PBR and be okay with it if it's going to sacrifice my red point.
Exactly. And, my first trip here to Lander 8 years ago, I guess, I stayed with Chris Lindner. And at the time, he was definitely a good climber, and he was in the upper, ranks of American climbers, but he wasn't the best climber by any means. But what he did that really impressed me and ended up having a really great trip here, he crushed a bunch of things in pretty quick succession, was that he wouldn't stay up and party with his friends, and he would get up super early to take advantage of the best temperatures. It's the middle of July. He knew that he needed to be at the crag at 6 or 7 a.m. to try and send something, and that's what he did. He would have a great time with his friends, but when 9 o'clock rolled around and it was time to start preparing for the next day, that's what he did.
Yeah, did the Irish goodbye. Like, where did he go?
And that was really impressive to me. You know, I hadn't really seen that happen with any pros that I'd hung out with at that point. So
yeah, and I think people try to anchor themselves onto really good climbers, still drinking a bunch of beer or whatever, staying up late and still climbing hard, but they don't think of the flip side, like what they could be doing if they weren't doing that. And it sounds like such a party pooper bummer way, but it's just the reality.
Yeah, for
and
sure.
We've all been there.
Yeah. Anything else you want to add to this, being a multi-sport athlete, Bo Jackson type of guy?
Man, Bo Jackson. I think people need to know that it's doable. Know that you are sacrificing your potential in certain sports that you like to do by trying to do multiple sports. But you can really focus your year around what you like to do. I mean, you can't have your cake and eat it. You got to pick and choose which one you want to be good at, maybe for a season or maybe for even a year. You can be a multi-sport athlete, and maybe for a solid year you're going to be a climber, and then for a solid year you're going to be a runner. It doesn't have to necessarily be within a calendar year or a year that you prescribe for yourself. But you have to sit down with a calendar and you got to write it out, because if you're just that person that kind of ebbs and flows with the season, you're going to be mediocre at everything.
And you're going to look back and think, wow, I could have made so much more of that.
Wasted years. Yeah,
had I really planned.
And yeah, folks should really think about challenging themselves to really, maybe they're a really good runner that it happens to also be a pretty good climber. Like, just put the running aside and just try to actually focus on climbing. And I think everyone will see a difference.
Yeah, if that's something you want to do,
that's something that you want
don't
to
be
do.
afraid. Yeah, I think
Exactly.
that's what it all comes down to.
Exactly.
Cool.
All
right, thanks, man. I appreciate it again.
As always, yeah, this is like, I went from 0 podcasts to 2 podcasts.
Yeah,
in
you're
like
you're a
2
pro
weeks.
now.
Oh,
You're going to
man.
take Steve's place as the
I told Steve
official
I'm
co-host.
gunning for his spot. No, it's funny. I did. Hopefully my sister hears this at some point, but I told her I was on a podcast recently, like last week, and she's like, "Oh, no way, what podcast?" I'm like, "Oh, you probably never heard of it. It's like this NPR, This American Life." And she's like, "What? What? Like you didn't tell me that?" And I was like, "No, like of course I wasn't on NPR." But this is like this is This American Life of Climbing
Are you
podcast.
trying to say we're not as good as
Hey,
NPR?
no, it is the This American Life of Climbing podcast. But yeah, no, it's always a pleasure, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris.
So there you have it, folks. The no-nonsense approach to being a multisport athlete from Charlie Manganiello. And, like I said before, I really like Charlie's, real-world, common-sense approach to this thing. He's not feeding you some kind of clickbait that says you can do everything at once and you can be amazing. He takes this real-world approach to it. You need to prioritize and you need to understand that sometimes you're going to be sacrificing performance in another area of your life. And that's okay. We're humans. That's how it works. So big thanks to Charlie for sitting down with me again. And hopefully we can do this again in the future. Once I'm settled in Lander, I hope to sit down with Charlie and Steve and the guys around there more often and keep bringing these things to you how I have been. So like I mentioned in the intro, go to iTunes, rate us, review us, and I'll be putting more of these things out. 4 more episodes in the next 2 months if I get a handful more reviews and ratings, and I would appreciate that. Also, if you want to become a patron, which helps us greatly, helps us keep this thing sponsor and commercial free, we're starting to develop our live podcast ideas, and you can do that by going onto our website, powercompanyclimbing.com, and clicking on the podcast tab, or you can visit our page at patreon.com/powercompanypodcast. And I will be headed to the new here shortly. I'll be headed to the south after that. We've got some workshops going on in the south that I'll be announcing soon. And then I'm headed over to Waco, where I've got some workshops going on around Texas and New Mexico. And maybe I'll see you guys at the Waco Rock Rodeo. But you're going to hear a lot from me between now and then, assuming you go to iTunes and rate us and review us. And temps are getting good here in the red right now, so I'm going to head out and try to send some things. Catch us on the Instagrams, on the Facebooks, and as you know, no Twitters. We don't tweet. We scream like eagles.
Maybe don't know.
This time, 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 this time,